So a couple days ago, I went and rewatched another old familiar movie that I remembered from back when I was a teenager. This time it's a good old 3D animated film from 2001 called Monsters Incorporated, which I'm sure you've never heard of. Released in November 2001. Back in '01, I was 10, but I definitely didn't watch it then. I first checked it out probably in '05 or '06, so when I was 14, 15, something like that. And I just remember being quite pleasantly surprised because I didn't usually think a whole lot of anything that was animated back then. Not that I checked out a lot of animated stuff. And then I even remember watching it like back to back early on. This one evening in particular, which was a terrible idea that particular evening because I had to get up for school in the morning. But anyway, so I thought, hey, why don't I go give this another rewatch as an adult and then see I'm going to see on the one hand if I still think it stacks up as a worthwhile piece of media. And then I also want to take some time and analyze what I think it was really all about anyway at the end of the day. Since for me, those two categories are usually pretty closely aligned. So if it really stacks up for me, that's going to be connected with the way I see it in terms of handling themes and ideas and expressiveness and stuff like that. Because it's not a question of whether a movie has any meaning in it, because a movie can't not have meaning if it tries. But instead, it'd be a question about how artistically that meaning is arranged, whether it bears the marks of intentionality, whether it provides a rewarding experience for the thinking and feeling watcher, that kind of thing. So anyway, I watched it and I got some good laughs. I was surprised that it was still funny after all these years. Uh, Definitely do feel that some parts have some bits of overdone slapstick where they have a good joke, but then it just keeps on going too far with the characters just being, overly slapsticky. But just in general, and especially toward the end of the film, I felt that it had a really good balance of good humor, like really funny humor, with good storytelling, like meaningful, compelling character type of storytelling. So what did I notice this time around? Well, first, the retro PC gamer inside me noticed three very important instances of Yorps from Commander Keen, except they had arms, and Yorps are very important for the world. Next, the rabid Star Trek fan inside me noticed their shameless use of Red Alert, as well as some very Star Trek techno babble that Randall's minion was spouting out, all about recalibrating the kilotronic witbots or something like that. So between Yorps and Red Alert and techno babble, I can't help but have warm and fuzzy feelings of wonderment toward this movie and its big fuzzy blue monsters. But what's that? Did you say I'm getting off track? Oh, well, pardon me. If you don't like Yorps, that's not my problem. Okay, well, so a couple of things that a couple of things that stood out to me the most this time watching it, other than the Yorps, are so first off, I got three or four things I'm going to kind of go through. First off, the really memorable way they kind of progress through really visually distinct acts or scenes. Second, the main theme, as I see it, and I'll get to that. Three, an additional kind of subliminal message, which it's kind of like a theme, but not quite. And then fourth, I want to talk about a slightly more mature kind of concept that shows up more toward the middle or the end of the film. So let me just go through those one by one. First off, the structure. So when I was just partway through this last time watching it, it just hit me how vivid the structural transitions are in certain parts of the film. And then I started kind of to pay attention to the structure. So definitely, while I definitely never noticed it per se as a teenager, I do remember being quite pulled along by certain key transition points where suddenly they go into a completely new environment and you're just like, whoa, okay, things are happening. And I think that's because this really is something that the movie does interestingly, does well. And I think it's going to this aspect that by the time you get to the end, you almost feel like you've watched a mini series. And in a way, you kind of did. It's kind of like a mini series of these little 20-minute episodes. So when you get to the laugh floor at the epilogue there, it really feels like an epilogue rather than just this is part of the movie Monsters Inc. Because technically it's just part of this very short 90-minute movie. But even though that's the case, they did a great job of just kind of making you feel like you've been in this universe for a really long time. And so this new setup with the laugh floor at the end is kind of new and different. And it's almost like it's a different episode or a different movie or something like that. At least that's how it's kind of always struck me to some degree. So as I thought about this, the structure, here's the 7-part succession that kind of seemed to surface for me. So we had Act 1, which basically introduces the monster world, Mike and Sully and all that. At this phase, there is no problem, quote unquote, in the sense of how a story is always kind of about a problem and how the problem, so in that sense, there is no problem in Act 1. Act 1 is just welcome to Monsterville, and welcome to Mike and Sully's world and all that. So it's entirely world building, very happy in tone. Act 2 is the whole Boo storyline. We're in the same environment as Act 1. It's Monsterville with Monsters Incorporated and everything. So it's the same environment more or less, but now the problem, quote unquote, has emerged, which is there's a child and everyone's trying to handle the problem of this child in various ways from various angles. Act 3 is Randall's evil plot. So the problem, quote unquote, changes entirely. Where we find out that Randall's not just mean, but he's a criminal. And then the standout part in this memorable scene would be the transition into Randall's secret lab, which kind of just recaptures your attention. You've been interested in Monsterville, which has been more or less the story up to this point. Monsterville without a problem, Monsterville with a little problem. And you've been watching the movie for however many minutes it is, and then suddenly the universe, the environment, suddenly we're in Randall's secret lab and you're just like, wow, okay, something new is happening here. It makes you feel like we just entered a completely new chapter with new visuals, new vibes, and a completely new kind of situation and a new kind of problem. Act 4 is banishment to the Winter Wonderland. Once again, like we just moved, a new chapter, a completely different world. And of course, this happens in terms of the ideas of the story. This happens right after Waternoose turns out to be in on Randall's evil plot. So once again, a very strongly memorable visual transition to go along with the transition of ideas. In terms of ideas, the problem of the story has once again ratcheted up from, started off, there's no problem, ratcheted up to, there's a child on the loose, ratcheted up to, there's corruption on the scare floor with Randall, now ratcheted up to, there's corruption at the very top of Monsters Incorporated with Waternoose. And then this act as well would also include the part where they get back to Monsters Incorporated, so they're not in the snowland, but it's still the same part of the story. So I put it in Act 4. And then Act 5, as I see it, would be the whole part with riding the doors. So once again, we're just in a new environment. They give us a new chapter with a new part of the story, and they give us a new environment. So we feel like we're in another episode or something. And this, in terms of the structure of the story, this would be when the rising action, if you want to use that term, the rising action comes to its first climax. And this would be the climax with the most tension, because it seems like there are 2 climaxes, but I'll get to that in a minute. But this is the one with the most tension, the whole conflict with Randall, the final conflict with Randall, basically. And then they finally beat Randall, and they throw him through the door, in that really cool bit. But then when they get back, Waternoose is waiting for them with the CDA to arrest them. And that would mark the beginning of Act 6, which I just put as the resolution. So this is the second climax, which already has, the tension is already winding down because the characters and the viewers are both tired from all the excitement of fighting Randall and winning. This is the part where the environment visual is back to our familiar Monsters Incorporated environment. Once again, a visual transition. And this is the scene where Sully lures Waternoose into the simulation room and tricks him into admitting his complicity. I would kidnap 1,000 children before I let this company die. I would kidnap 1,000. That wonderful bit there. So Waternoose is taken away. Number 1 is revealed as the head of the CDA. And there is a quiet, tender scene as Sully says his final goodbye to Boo. And it really feels like the end of the story. And then we get the epilogue, or Act 7, if you prefer, which really feels quite distinctly, to me, it's always felt very distinctly like an epilogue. Almost like it's a separate story. When the scare floor has become the laugh floor, so we get to have some fun time watching just a normal day in this new world, which is kind of like a rehash of Act 1, because remember Act 1, more or less, or at least somewhere in there, was the introduction to Monsterville, where you just got to see like a day in the life of. And now at the very end, it's kind of like we come full circle and we're back to a day in the life of, but it's the new world, almost like this is the intro to the new chapter or something like that. But anyway, so we do that, but then after that, we get this quiet, tender moment where Sully's looking through his clipboard and he flips to his little crayon drawing from Boo. So we get that quiet moment before the scene where Mike shares with him the reconstructed door, and Sully puts in the last piece, and then the movie ends with Sully walking through it to be reunited with Boo. And the credits roll, and we hear Mike and Sully singing, "I wouldn't be nothing if I didn't have you." So that's what I mean when I say, about how some of the structural elements seem to be, kind of really noticeable, and that kind of makes it stand out. And then it's really fun when you kind of assign a structure to it, which is what I just did with my 7 acts there, or 6 acts and an epilogue. So while some of the divisions that I just listed there would maybe be a little arbitrary on my part, so particularly 3A and 4B, and then the distinction between acts 4 and 5, that's kind of arbitrary. Like I look at it and figure out what makes the most sense, but it's not like I'm just seeing what's there and it's obvious. But so while that is the case, what I'm kind of remarking about is just that there are a lot of them that are such clear and vivid transitions that it ends up feeling kind of like a mini series. And I think especially the changes of scenery, the environment play a big role in just keeping things interesting and keeping you engaged at every point, and giving you the feeling by the end, giving you the feeling that a lot of time has passed for our characters, even though the movie is only 90 minutes. It's barely longer than a slow motion sneeze. And it's also kind of fun once you've got that visual in your head of the 7-part outline. It's kind of fun to think about how it plays into the generic literary structure of a story. And I kind of alluded to this in the stuff that I just said as well. But so if you think of the generic story structure, the kind of thing that I learned in high school, if you think of the generic story structure as introduction, problem, rising tension, climax, and then denouement, if I'm pronouncing that word right. So that's your basic structure. This story fits into that in kind of like a clean as a whistle kind of way. We have the intro to the world, the part where there is no problem, and we're just finding out about this really, until you've first seen the movie, it's a really different, exciting, fun to explore world. And then we get our very basic problem, which is when the kid is introduced. It's a human kid, but then the tension and interest build through that act, so building tension, yes, but the problem is still, it's still the same problem, but it's not a very big deal. We're having fun. We're not concerned for our characters. So the tension and interest are building, but then the tension and interest kind of take a jump up when Randall's evil plot is introduced in Act 3, with the kind of the danger and fear that we experience inside the secret lab, because the Watcher never felt a sense of danger from Boo being loose, but we do now. And then the problem increases again, takes another jump up, and increases again to its max once Water News is implicated and the characters are stranded in the winter wasteland. So by that point, the problem has become full formed. Now we know what the problem is, but the tension keeps on rising to its climax, the climax being the fight with Randall inside when all the doors are, the door area. And then after that, right, when, they threw Randall through the door, and they're like, "It's a crocodile, knock him silly," and they get a shovel and beat poor Randall silly, But then right when you expect them to get Boo home, instead, we get a second climax after everyone's already kind of tired out / kind of in relaxed mode after the climax. We get kind of a second climax. And unfortunately, Water News is in that climax. He's overcome. He's finally caught and taken care of. So it's kind of like we had the climax, and then we were getting ready to go down, and then we had another climax. And then all the tension's gone. Everything kind of winds down. The denouement, if that's the right word. But as that happens, the story ends with a different kind of problem in the air, namely the new problem of Monsters Incorporated shutting down, most likely. That's what they all say. They're like, "This place is going to be shut down. What are you so happy for? We're losing our jobs." So that problem, and then also Sully being sad. So the problem has been resolved, that evolving problem, it's been resolved, but now there's this other problem. So the story ends as the tension goes off and the story's over. But there's this new problem, completely different problem. So the epilogue, kind of like this last little, like we started with the intro, and it's like there's this last intro to whatever your imagination thinks comes next, which is the epilogue. And the epilogue gives us just a glimpse through the window into the new, energetic, happy day-by-day life. Because remember, the tension is going out, and things are getting quieter and gentler, and then we get this glimpse through the window into the buzzing day-by-day life on the lath floor, as well as Mike giving Sully the reconstructed door, and then we get the happy ending. So once you kind of look at it and think of it like that, it's a really nice kind of structurally perfect process of rising tension and then this double climax and the resolution, and then an epilogue that seems to take place after the primary resolution in a sense. So with some of those bits like the double climax as I see it and the multiple resolutions as I see it, with stuff like that going on, and also with all the really highly visual environment transitions within the movie, like when they first get into Randall's secret lab, when they get suddenly stranded in the winter wasteland, with all those kinds of things going on, no wonder it feels like there's just always more and more and more. Because that was the feeling I remember having as a teenager, was like you're watching partway through and it's like, oh, there's more, and even like on the rewatch, you still kept having that feeling because you just forgot, oh, here we are, more interest, what's going on, And part of the reason maybe is because that's kind of what's going on structurally. They chose to, instead of giving us a Big Mac, they chose to give us a whole bunch of little burgers of every different kind, So in that sense, the plot kind of feels dense, kind of like a lot of the scenes, the highly detailed and amusing 3D generated miscellany in every scene. It's kind of like that. The story as a whole, the story itself is kind of tightly packed with more story elements than you would normally necessarily expect, which maybe is part of why it was so fun for me to rewatch it multiple times as a teenager. All right, so those are some of my thoughts about the structural aspects of the film. I think it's fascinating to look at the film as a series of distinct transition points in terms of the evolving story concept and the quite distinct environments. And I think it makes the film feel really tidy once you notice the structural layout. But next, I'd like to talk about what I think is the main theme. I'll also talk later on about a separate concept, which is kind of like a theme, works more on a subliminal level, but I'll get to that later. For the main theme, I feel pretty comfortable concluding. So I'll just give you my conclusion before I give you my reasons. I feel pretty comfortable concluding the main theme of the movie is friendship/love. I think the main point would be something to the effect of friends matter, or friendship matters, or maybe a similar idea like the people you love and your connection with those people is of incomparable value. It's to be cherished at all costs, in contrast to, losing those people or being unkind to them, or, so something like that. One of the first things that started me toward thinking of that kind of thing as the theme was when it kind of stood out to me, the two most emotionally standout calm moments in the film. These kind of moments where the depth of the quiet of the scene was so noticeable that it kind of made me in the moment start to wonder if it was really supposed to be kind of like an emotional spotlight. Not necessarily that you're supposed to notice it, kind of like good music in a film. You don't notice it, but you're affected by it. I started to wonder that just because so much of the film keeps clipping along at a fairly consistent, happy, jumping along pace without really emotionally deep, quiet moments. So these two scenes that stood out, the first one where I was kind of like, oh, wow, this is important. This was the quiet moment in the abominable snowman's cave. That bit of dialogue between Mike and Sully, and the energy level of the film has just kind of rested down. But instead of being just like, the meaningless quiet moment so that we can be all energetic when it comes back, instead of that, it's a really emotionally, relationally meaningful scene, which feels deeply compelling and is kind of padded in on all sides by content that supports it. And the main topics in the discussion are basically Sully's dedication to saving Boo at any cost, and Mike's unwillingness to continue to accept Sully as his friend. So this is the part where Mike tells Sully, I'm through with you, So you could say the topics thematically speaking, the topics are friendship, determination to do what's right, and love. And then it concludes with Mike and Sully's friendship broken, and Sully going out, choosing to follow his values still, even in the face of burned friendships. And the viewer rides along, experiencing these things and experiencing that decision and what it meant, and experiencing loss and what it meant and stuff like that. But particularly, we're all riding along, we're supposed to be at least riding along with Sully as he goes down that hill. We're riding along with his decision to say, this matters. And it's horrible to lose a friend like Mike, but there is no cost too high to going to save, this person he cares about. So that was the one. And then the second standout, quiet emotional moment that stood out to me was in the epilogue, when we just saw everybody buzzing around, in this new lab floor. And Sully's doing his day of work, and then he just kind of quietly and sadly flips his clipboard to that crayon drawing from Boo. And he just kind of quietly, sadly, I think he probably sighs. He's probably like, oh, and that really emotional and expressive, quiet flavor is not typical for this style of movie, for this specific movie. It's not, you don't see a lot of that, because the movie just kind of goes along at a steady clip. And the movie presents most emotions just as an opportunity for some more slapstick, which is fine, because that's the genre. But given that, since it's such a unique moment, it seems like an important moment. And kind of like the rest of the film is there to reinforce that little moment. It's kind of like that moment has the kind of sensitivity that couldn't be done. It couldn't be done in a moving manner, at least. It couldn't be done back in the opening scene, because you just can't do that in the opening scene of an animated children's comedy. You can't do that and expect it to be impactful. But it can be done very effectively at the end, when you padded it in through the whole movie with stuff that supports it. And for that, what's the topic in view? Well, basically, people you love matter. Losing them is tough, and having them is priceless. And I also left out, there's also an extended, tender goodbye between Sully and Boo. And I didn't mention that because while it is also quiet and moving, it doesn't stand out, or at least didn't stand out to me the same way for a variety of reasons. But I mean, it's definitely important. It definitely fits into the same concept. So the first thing that kind of hinted to me that this is probably the theme was just noticing those two quiet, deep moments there. But the second thing that suggested that to me, and this is the part that made me pretty certain that I'm definitely found the main theme of the movie, was the way the show's final happy ending, quote unquote, played out. Which is not just important because it's the last thing you see in the movie. That's often significant if they choose to end it on an impactful note, and that could be significant. But I think it also feels important because it seems, and it feels, at least to me, very much like it's supposed to be a stereotypically as happy as possible kind of happy ending. That's the feeling you get from it, in the sense that the content of the happy ending is basically taking everything that was ever on the table for us for the movie and taking all the important parts and making all of them as good as possible. That's the feeling you get at the end. I think that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be like the happy ending of all happy endings, And of course, the happy ending I'm referring to is right after Sully looks quietly and longingly at the crayon drawing, like I just mentioned. Then Mike comes in, and he ends up showing his friendship and dedication as a friend by giving Sully this door that he painfully reconstructed, which enables Sully to be reunited with Boo, so that the movie ends with him walking through that door. So the happy ending here, it's basically expressing both expressions of the same theme together in one scene. These two aspects being the two people who Sully cares about more than anybody else, both of whom he lost at some point within the story. They put both of those together in the same scene to show the beauty and joy of togetherness. For the watcher, whether or not you would have been able to identify the theme, whether or not you would have been able to identify it, you undoubtedly feel the theme as you watch the movie. Whether or not you notice, the story is there for you to notice the fact that the people who care about you matter. And so the kind of thing where, you know, if you've let grudges or closed doors, because those are kind of the two things here, if you've let grudges or closed doors or whatever else get between you and the people who care about you, that's tragic. You know, and if you don't, on the other hand, if you're one of those people who's watching it and you don't have grudges or closed doors keeping you from your loved ones, well, that's beautiful. And it's something to cherish and express gratitude for, and maybe express gratitude and appreciation to whoever, you know, as in that closing song. I wouldn't be nothing if I didn't have you, you know. So yeah, that's what I think about the main theme. I think this is a great message to have in a high quality children's film. It's a great thing for a movie to be saying, because kids need to hear that, parents need to hear that, and everybody in between needs to hear that. Because it's so easy to live life and take people for granted, or worse yet, to cut people off or forget about people who just because they aren't currently in your line of sight, you know. But the other extreme of being like Mike and taking pains, you know, he has blistery fingers or whatever he had there, you know, those red marks from putting all that together. To be like Mike and taking pains to try to help somebody find the thing they love the most. That's the kind of attitude our world needs more of. It needs more of people who care about others and care enough to know what matters to them and still care. Now, to change the subject a little bit, I mentioned that I also see a separate kind of subliminal message going on, separate from the main theme as I see it. I guess this is one that is probably fairly obvious to a lot of people, and this is definitely for me, this was the first thing that popped in my head back as a teenager watching the early portions of the film. I don't think it really counts as the main theme because it doesn't form an emotionally impactful centerpiece in the structure like what I described in the above. But I do think it's clearly intended to have an impact, have a real impact in relation to young kids that might be scared of monsters in their closet or might, you know, be about to develop that kind of fear, you know, in the next stage of their life or whatever. So this isn't a cognitive message primarily, but an experiential one, seen in its most explicit form in that opening scene where the scary monster is coming up in the dark. He's coming up to the kid's bed in the dark. And then the monster screams in fear and the lights come on and the monster isn't scary at all. And we're all supposed to laugh. And I think they stretch out some of that a little too much when the slapstick just gets absurd. But the important part is the first part when they both scream and the monster slips on a ball, you know, and even a 6-year-old or maybe even a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old, I don't know, but even the littlest kid will probably receive the message because it's nonverbal and it's experiential. And that message, though not a theme in the typical sense, that message is subliminally kind of reinforced and amplified throughout the course of the film as we explore Monsterland. We get to explore Monsterland and its various parts of it and various aspects of it. We explore it as a fun and quirky place to be. And then at the end of the movie, the scare floor has become the laugh floor. So we get to the end with the laugh floor, and it's kind of the culmination of all that because the scariness is completely gone. And then similarly, the fact that the way they combine this category of monsters in your closet, and they combine that theme with the theme of love and friendship, that's also part of the formula. You know, where these two themes intersect very significantly. You know, in other words, we all feel warm and fuzzy feelings for Big Fuzzy Blue Sully and his tender, compassionate face. But he's one of the monsters who hides in your closet, you know. So they're intentionally combining these together. So in that sense, this movie is the literal psychotherapeutic opposite of a horror film for kids. And incidentally, also, whereas horror films, almost by definition, they're not allowed to have anything good in the ending. Not that I really watch horror films, but that's what I hear people say is the predictable, way it works. But in contrast to that, Monsters Inc. Has all conceivable good and no bad allowed in its happy ending, which is appropriate if we really say to ourselves, well, this kind of is the intentional psychotherapeutic opposite of a horror film. It's worth noting that in terms of psychotherapeutic approaches to handling fear, most people will need some combination of cognitive and experiential approaches to treatment for serious fear-related issues. And what I mean by cognitive means dealing with your thoughts and beliefs, your cognitions. What do you think? What do you believe? What do you expect? What is true as you see it? That's the cognitive side, which is really important for handling fear-related issues. And for some people, that might be all they need. But experientially, what I mean by that is the part where your physiological self may not agree with your cognitive self. It may not agree with your thoughts and beliefs until it has had experiences, until you, as a physiological whole person, until you've had experiences that change the unconscious narrative that your brain/body has learned. I think one small role that this movie may be intended to play is to give kids a little bit of an experiential boost regarding those childhood fears. Those kinds of fears, which are sometimes much more problematic for certain kids than for others, for a variety of reasons. But some kids really, really significantly struggle, and I mean, because sometimes it doesn't necessarily do as much good as we might think to just tell yourself there are no monsters in my closet. It's not necessarily going to do that much good to tell yourself that if as soon as you shut your eyes, you see the vicious beast staring at you through your imagination. So it doesn't matter what words you're trying to put in your head, you can see it coming at you the moment you shut your eyes. But what Monsters Incorporated does is introduce another set of images that can pop into a kid's head. That maybe Sully's hiding in your closet, or Mike, or one of those amusing tentacle monstrosities, in Monsterville. And I think that's pretty cool. Also, a little comment about scary and ugly versus good and cuddly. Though this movie is about monsters, scary monsters, that's kind of the topic. Though that is the case, it kind of follows the fairy tale approach to attractiveness in the movie. All the scary looking monsters are evil, and all the good monsters are cuddly or generally appealing looking, especially the most important characters, Sully and Randall, and Waternoose and Mike. And I guess you could argue that Cecilia is kind of in between because she's got the snakes, but she definitely doesn't look scary. So this is an element, the whole, attractiveness versus unattractiveness. It's an element that I've heard pointed out as a flaw in many kinds of fiction throughout history. It's not just a modern problem, but that person who made that comment pointed it out as happening most notably, most significantly in the early forms of the stories that have now turned into our more popular fairy tales. So it's in our fairy tales, but especially in the roots of those and the early versions of them. And maybe this is going to resonate with you. The fact that witches that are ugly are bad, partly because they're so ugly, and princesses that are beautiful are good. And that partly because they're so beautiful, And sometimes in the early forms of those stories, they actually kind of explicitly made comments that connected things like that. And I don't have the resource where I first found this, but it was something to the effect of, you go through and you find multiple comments like, and there was this fairy, and she's so beautiful and pure and goodness incarnate, or you find the ugly witch, and just the way you refer to things, you realize that the kind of the narrative of the story is that if something looks scary and ugly, it probably is. Which of course isn't the way the real world works. It's kind of a symbolic way of seeing things. And you can see how that could become really problematic if that's kind of is the way a lot of fiction, a lot of movies and stuff, they do that without trying, because we like to see good looking characters and we like to see villains that are ugly, whatever it is in us. But anyway, so in light of that, it's interesting to note that Monsters, Inc. follows a paradigm kind of not unlike that fairy tale approach. But I guess given the greater context that I've just talked about, the whole subliminal messaging about helping kids overcome fear, this is about the monsters in your closet that you're scared of, with all that in mind, I think it is kind of appropriate for Monsters Incorporated to have, the scary spider with 5 eyes. He doesn't even have 6, he has 5. But anyway, the scary spider with 5 eyes ends up being the villain, and fuzzy old Sully, he's the good guy, I think it is kind of appropriate considering what they're trying to do. The intended subliminal message of the story is that if a monster is coming for you, he may be fuzzy and soft-hearted like Sully, or agreeable and pleasant and not scary like the various miscellaneous monsters. Of course, other than Randall and Waternoose, but they've been taken care of. We got rid of them, and they're vastly the minority in Monsterville. So if somebody in your closet is probably not Randall, and you can beat him with a bat, That's another element that fits into this. And this is one element, this new one that I'm getting into now. Here's an element that I've always felt was kind of, now here I'm going to insult Monsters Incorporated. I love the movie, but here's my insult. There's this particular scene that I've always felt was eyebrow-raisingly cheesy and a really poor plot element. It's the scene where Randall was finally defeated. And he was defeated just by Boo jumping on his back and hitting him, and then she magically beats him silly. She gets her bat, And it just, when I first saw it as a teenager, it just didn't make any sense to me, except for the painfully obvious subliminal messaging aspect, Well, that made instant sense to me. You can't miss it. But beyond that, within the universe, within the story, within the plot structure, it just made no sense to me. And to this day, it still doesn't. If this is supposed to be the child toxic kind of thing that the CDA was all worried about, if that's what this is about, then she should have been touching him or something to make it happen. But instead, she's still inside her suit. She hits him with her tentacle arms, and then she hits him with the bat. So this isn't her child germs that's making him do that. This is the one scene in the movie that I've just always found eye-rollingly absurd. Makes me roll my eyes. And very annoying, particularly because it's at such a major plot transition point. This is when they kill one of the most important villains of the story. There are basically 2 villains, and this is how we kill arguably the scarier of the 2. And then it's especially annoying because this happens after a lot of tension has built up. So once again, this is important in a sense. And then this is how it resolves. I think the word that really applies here is the word gratuitous, in the sense that the general idea of kids not having to be afraid of imaginary monsters is a good idea to have, but this is just over the top. And not to mention the fact that, in addition to kids knowing that monsters aren't going to get them at night, in addition to that, kids also need to know that they can't expect to beat up somebody who's 5 times their size, just in general. That's not how life works. So this is the one scene I just don't think belongs. I don't think it works. Maybe you'll disagree, and that's okay, because I can have all the nasty opinions I want, because I can be a grump when I want to be. But all right, so I mentioned I wanted to talk about the main theme and then this other subliminal theme, which I just finished talking about, as well as some kind of more mature ideas in some sense in the film. And so that's what I'm getting to now. So definitely one theme that stands out to me a lot more now than when I was younger is the theme of the abuse of power and scandal and cover-ups. Basically, in other words, corruption within leadership structures. Specifically, this is a theme that shows up most noticeably with Waternoose and him as the trusted head of Monsters Incorporated. and then his willingness to hurt others for his own gain, for the advancement of the company, for his own, aggrandizement. And then especially his eagerness to do anything to cover up his complicity and all that. Specifically, his behaviors that were supposed to silence those people who could possibly expose him. Remember when he banished our heroes to Siberia or wherever he banished them to. I mean, man, it's almost like you hear any echoes of Alien and Aliens. It's kind of like the same thing. It's the company and the guy in the company. There's probably more people, or there could be more people. I mean, the difference here is that once they got to the people above Waternoose, then it's okay. More of the vibe that you get from Aliens is more like there is nobody you can go to because they're all corrupt, but it's very much the same idea, and it's built on stuff that happens in real life, unfortunately. So I guess one of the really standout kind of memorable moments in the movie for this particular theme would be, at least for me, this last time watching it, the part that stood out to me was just when that part where Sully kind of finally comes back to Mike and Waternoose, and Mike is just finishing up telling the story, and he's just kind of letting it out in one breath, and then this happened and that happened, and Waternoose is like, oh, okay. And it's just kind of, it's the great big share with the authority figure, that great big moment when you finally get to share it with somebody who can help, soon to be disappointed. And then also tied in here would be the concept of the scream extractor, that machine, and its humorous role, but probably also, I think, probably also some kind of metaphorical reference to something much more terrifying. Probably my guess is that there's no one specific thing that the creators had in mind when they put in the scream extractor. There's maybe no one specific thing, but kind of just the terrifying range of the things that abusive people in power do to the innocent, And what came to my mind was maybe it's kind of a combined reference to torture, rape, and or unethical medical stuff, experimentation. And probably more on the sexual side, especially because, it's been observed that sexual abuse, when it comes to people in power, a lot of the time it's not so much about pleasure as much as it's about domination, which is basically what motivates Randall to subject Mike to the machine. It's domination. But the point, I think, is that it's an unthinkable form of physical and psychological trauma that's going to leave the victim helpless to stop it. So you sit there and you're tied down, you can't, you are helpless. You can only watch as this is done to you. And this is something which the corrupt person in power, or in this case, it's just the leadership in general at various levels, because it's not just Randall. It's Randall, and then the other people are either endorsing it, like Waternoose, or failing to confront it, which is a lot of the time it has the same effect. So then the key ingredients, if we're trying to figure out what is this, kind of metaphorically speaking, what is this? The key ingredients would be, one, that the evil person receives gain, so either personal, financial, or social/business gain, or maybe it's just for domination and sadism, but the person receives gain. And then two, the victim receives intense trauma and irreversible damage. So the concept implied here is pretty heavy once you realize what kind of thing it's really kind of pointing to. And honestly, for myself, even with the really lighthearted, humorous style, there's still something a little disturbing about seeing the henchman after he was scream extracted. You see him and he's all white and he's kind of struggling to breathe. This last time watching it, it's just a little disturbing. It's a little hard to watch. Unfortunately, it only lasts about 2 seconds, because the fact is that many victims of corrupt abusers will never be the same again. And of course, in this genre of a children's sci-fi fantasy comedy, in this genre, we're not going to see those long-lasting consequences playing out. But this is the kind of thing that leads to ruined lives and crippling PTSD. I mean, this is kind of like in the early parts of the Aliens film. This is like Ripley's disillusioned misery as she's working in this dead end job and she's having flashbacks all the time and she can't live. That's the kind of thing that comes from this kind of theme here in the real life version of it. So pretty heavy stuff. And they put it in a way that, is not going to traumatize kids or scare them, but they put it in because this is the kind of thing. There are monsters, there are monsters for kids to, at some point as they grow up, to learn to be legitimately afraid of and to realize that there's going to be difficulty handling monsters sometimes. And then, in light of the heaviness of that theme, I think this is a good time to restate something I said a while back, and I did a video on why kids' books can be so fun to read and such a positive, experience. One of the wonderful parts about much children's fiction, which is a category that Monsters Inc. belongs to, it's just it's consciously adult friendly children's fiction, but it is children's fiction. But one of the wonderful parts about a lot of children's fiction is the intentionally low level of the stakes. The stakes are low, making it a very happy experience to watch because all the terrible stuff, in all story there has to be a problem. But in most children's fiction, the problem isn't something that makes you want to curl up inside. It's something that you can kind of escape the troubles in life and watch, the troubles of paradise, as it were, as the heroes try to solve this problem, but you don't have to have any of these horrible feelings about how bad the problem is. And so in this story, there's no point where you are really afraid that anything truly dreadful is going to happen. Sully may have thought that Boo got garbage crushed, but the Watcher never did. And those really intense moments when Randall is punching Sully, he's invisible, he's punching Sully senseless. Well, those may have been some intense moments, but we all just got to laugh about Mike's bumbling apology the whole time, and we kind of knew everything's going to be okay. And this all just contributes to the really anti-horror flavor of the movie. Not just because it's a comedy, which kind of is anti-horror in a sense, but not just because of that, but because it's self-conscious. It's a self-consciously pleasant children's fiction comedy, intentionally aimed at diminishing the subliminal impact of this imaginary category of the monsters in your closet, while also carrying its watchers through an experiential story of friendship, love, connection, forgiveness, and loyalty. It reminds the viewer experientially that you can't trust everyone, but some people are worth all the love and loyalty that can be had. So, in addition to sleeping at night, being able to sleep at night while facing your closet, in addition to that, what are you supposed to come away from Monsters, Inc. with? Well, I guess for starters, maybe a little bit of recognition of the power of fear. The fact is, whether there's a scream to go with it or not, fear drives all kinds of things. It powers all kinds of things. It's like electricity, it runs machines, it runs systems, keeps lights on and it keeps lights off. Fear is like electricity. There's very little that is like it. So definitely that, but probably also a little bit of recognition maybe of the power of laughter. Since not only have you been laughing throughout the film, but laughter is its own kind of power. I mean, at the end of the film, it's one of the power sources, bringing life and joy to what used to be the scare floor. With laughter, maybe there's a little less reason to be scared of the monsters in your closet, for example. Let's have three: fear, laughter, and maybe the third power is the big one at the top, the most significant because it's the main theme of the movie. Maybe the biggest power, to borrow a line from Dumbledore, who I guess ultimately he borrowed the idea from Jesus, I guess. But to borrow a line from Dumbledore, maybe the real power in this story is the power of love. The power behind when a big old fuzzy guy like Sully cherishes and protects at any cost somebody who's smaller than him and can't help him in the least. The power behind when one friend goes and puts in these hours of painstaking effort to help another friend get something that he lost. Power behind forgiveness and a humble apology that brings friends back together. The power behind the moment of someone reaching out, even when you might reject him or her. The power behind barriers getting replaced by understanding, empathy, undying goodwill, and hope. All that, even when the person may have claws, 3 heads, or child toxicity. I guess that's what really overcomes fear, isn't it? Well, that's it for this video. If you like the way I analyze stuff, then feel free to subscribe for more discussions about movies, shows, books, stuff like that. Most of my videos end up talking to some degree about the overlap where sci-fi or fantasy meets with psychology, philosophy, or spirituality, or something else in that domain. So if that kind of thing sounds interesting, then definitely go ahead and hit subscribe. But otherwise, I'll catch you around. And whatever you do, make sure you keep your closet shut at night.